All right, we've got 5 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to wrap up the very end of the application from the last lesson, like I mentioned on Wednesday night. So we'll do that real quickly from the end of lesson 10, and then we'll move on into today's lesson, lesson 11. Before we begin, though, Dave's going to lead us in a word of prayer. Amen. Thanks, Dave. All right, so back to the end of lesson 10, so chapter 5 with Belshazzar, the end of the Babylonian kingdom. And the last question was applications for us. And so we talked about pride, which we actually talked about Nebuchadnezzar also in the previous chapter, chapter 4. And then we talked about God's control over our government, not just their government, but our government as well, and some applications that we can make out of that fact. And so the last one that we didn't get to was the last part of that question. I asked you what are some applications that we can make from speaking to others so they hear what they need to from God. So what did you put down or think about for that? Let me ask you this, kind of as you get your wheels rolling, because I know that's not where your mind was. And I'm asking you a tough question right off the bat, which is not a good way to start a class probably. But do you think, thinking about Daniel talking to Nebuchadnezzar back in chapter 4 with the tree dream and what was going to happen to him, and then with Belshazzar, do you think going in front of the king and giving either one of those kings that kind of news, was that an easy task for Daniel? Yeah, and giving them that truth that they need to hear, right? And if you think back with Nebuchadnezzar, he told him, "Repent. I urge you to repent. Maybe God will not bring this upon you if you change your ways." He didn't give that same message to Belshazzar in the same way, but he did tell him what was going on in his relationship with God, right? He made that very clear. And so that's, I think, a big lesson for us, that even in a very difficult situation, I mean, do you think there would be anybody in the whole world more difficult to give that message to than who he was talking to? Probably not. I mean, he's talking to the king of the most powerful nation in the world at that point in time, especially with Nebuchadnezzar, but even here with Belshazzar. And he didn't hesitate to tell them what they needed to hear from God. All right. Yeah, it does. And thinking in their time too, they were talking to people who weren't believers in God. I mean, with Nebuchadnezzar, he knew who God was to some degree because we'd seen what had happened in the progression. So he knew God, and he had made proclamations about God, but he wasn't truly a follower yet at that point in time. It didn't seem. Belshazzar certainly isn't. He has just totally, dissed God with what he's done, and he's been, worshiping their idols and putting them above God, and so he clearly isn't. And yet, Daniel told him what he needed to know about God. So that's a big lesson for us that, whenever the situation arises, to point out to people where they stand in their relationship with God, if that's something that they need to hear. I'm sorry, I don't quite follow what your point there. Oh, yeah. Yeah, and we actually saw that with actually every chapter of Daniel. We've seen that. We're going to see that again today. So yes, if we're going to do what's right, there's going to be potential consequences a lot of the time. We're seeing situations where things turn out for the good, and we'll talk about that some here in this class and the next one with Daniel and the situation with the lion's den. So let's move into this chapter. Whoops, I went one too far there. I didn't. Okay, so let's talk about the Medo-Persian Empire. So just from a world history standpoint, what had just happened at the end of chapter 5, verses 30 and 31? Because it kind of transitions right into this chapter. Babylon falls, Medo-Persian Empire is now the controlling empire, right? So we've seen a big change in who the world power is, from Babylon to the Medo-Persian Empire. And then how did that relate to the image back in chapter 2 of the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had? I like this particular image. We're down to the next level now, right? Because the head of gold's gone, and so we moved to the silver. And Daniel told him, God told him through Daniel that this is going to be a successive kingdom that's going to come after yours. You're the head of gold, and there's going to be another one that comes after you that's inferior. So is Medo-Persia a country? No, it's a kind of kingdom. So we'll talk about that. Who's the ruler of the Medo-Persian Empire at this point in time when this event happens? Well, Darius is of Babylon, we see here, but who's actually the ruler of the whole kingdom, do you know? Cyrus. Yeah, Cyrus is actually the king. So if you look on your question sheet, there's a little bit of history at the top. We'll cover that quickly, and then I'm going to give you a little more information that'll maybe help flesh some of this out for you. But Media is this area right here. I'm not sure what language this map is in, but I've looked at a lot of different maps, and I like this one the best, the way it laid the colors out. So I don't know if this is Italian background or what, but here's Media right here. This is Persia down in this area. This would be the Babylonian Empire that went through this area right here. So that's kind of what we're looking at with where the Median area and the Persian area is. Cyaxares was the king. If you want to look at your timeline, that might help you, or you can think just kind of linearly. But back in 614, so that's before Nebuchadnezzar had conquered Jerusalem or had attacked Jerusalem in 605. So before that, Cyaxares was the king of the Medo-Persian Empire. He was Median, and he marched on the Assyrians up in this area right in here. And Nabopolassar, the king of Babylon at that point, took advantage of that, marched up and met him there, and they made an alliance. And after that, Nebuchadnezzar's granddaughter was married to him, and so that kind of bonded the alliance. Moving forward now, this is not on your question sheet there, but the Medes actually, as I mentioned, they were the kind of of this whole area, they were the controlling force, even though Persia was really kind of a different country, Media was. Just, you can kind of think of that like Babylon controlled all of this area, but this wasn't really Babylon. They controlled it, but it was part of the Babylonian Empire. So it's the same thing here. This is the Medo-Persian Empire, but the Medes control the Persians. So in 550 BC, Cyrus defeated, Cyrus is Persian. He defeated the king of Media, who was his grandfather. I read in one account it was his uncle, but most things say it was his grandfather, King Astyages. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. But so his grandfather was the king here, and he came up and conquered and kind of took over the kingdom. So that's what put Cyrus in charge. Cyrus had actually been encouraged by his grandfather, Astyages. I'll write that up here because I don't know how it's pronounced. That way if you see it in writing somewhere. So he was the king from Media, but he was the king of the whole empire. But his general, Harpagus, had kind of encouraged Cyrus to revolt against him. So I don't know what was going on that caused that to happen, but he had encouraged Cyrus to revolt and kind of aided in that. And so Cyrus took over and became the king and consolidated the two kingdoms kind of into one at that point in time. Cyrus has a known practice, so when you read in history, I guess this is very well known. He had a practice to kind of unify the kingdom and promote goodwill of putting people that were from the Median Empire in high positions. So a lot of times when somebody would come in, they would make their own people in charge. But what he did was he actually consolidated by bringing others in. So you could think of in our country, maybe what he was doing was, let's say, the incoming president for us, President Trump, if he said, okay, I'm going to bring in a bunch of people from the Democratic Party and put them in high positions also. That's kind of what Cyrus was doing in a sense, that he was keeping people from the country he had conquered and putting them in high positions to kind of unite everything and try to keep it from being like a us versus them. So it's known that he did that a lot to promote goodwill within the empire. He continued to treat his grandfather with respect, the king of the Median Empire. Even though he had conquered him, he treated him with respect and appointed him as the ruler over Barcania. I don't remember where that is on the map here, but I think it's up in this area, that he made him kind of the ruler over that area, even though he had conquered him. He made this city right here in Media, he made that his capital. So even though he was from down in this area, he made this his capital to kind of keep the kingdom united. He kept a lot of the Median officials in their posts. And I think this is all helpful information, because as we start talking about Darius, it'll kind of make sense, some of the things we read about Darius. That's why I'm giving you this information. But he made this kind of the administrative seat of the joint kingdom. The power change when he took over was so discreet that outside countries didn't really treat it as if it was any different. They still looked at it like the Median or Persian Empire. Herodotus and Xerxes, who are historians, they use the term Medes or Persians interchangeably because of that. So they could say Medes, they might say Persians, because it was all the same country. So it was a discrete takeover from that standpoint. So that background, knowing how he did things within the kingdom, might help us to understand why there's somebody, Darius the Mede, that's placed in charge of Babylon. Does that make sense? That's why I gave you that background information. So any questions about that? Clear as mud with the boring history? Okay. So let's go to the question, who was Darius? Darius, it says, was the Darius the Mede. If you look back in chapter 5, verse 31, Darius the Mede received the kingdom being about 62 years old. And then that brings us into chapter 6. So who was Darius? So this has been an issue, kind of like we talked about with Belshazzar for a long time, up until the 1850s, when archaeologists discovered things that ultimately, as they were read, had Belshazzar's name on it. And then it went on to tell us that he was the son of Nabonidus. And then as they uncovered and read more of it, we found out, oh, he actually was in charge of the kingdom. So it confirmed what Daniel had said. Well, we're kind of back to before that time with Darius. There's nothing that's been uncovered that says anything about a Darius ruling the kingdom of Babylon. Nothing at all. And so critics will still say, well, that's a flaw in Daniel. So he doesn't, we know Cyrus was the king. This was a mistake. And obviously, none of us in the room would probably accept that. But because some people do, let's talk about it a little bit. That will help us to understand that, but also maybe help us with somebody else at some point in time. And just as a reminder, I think I mentioned this a couple weeks ago. If you look online about who is Darius the Mede, most of the things you'll say will say he's a fictional character from the book of Daniel that's just made up. So unless you're looking at a site that's Bible-based. But if you're looking at just kind of general academic information, that's what it's going to tell you. So it's been used to try to disprove Daniel. Again, people want to disprove Daniel because we're getting ready to start into a whole bunch of prophecy with the next chapter that if it's true prophecy, then obviously this book is from God. And people that don't want to believe in God have to disprove that. So let me just point out to you, Daniel boldly references Darius in 5:31 that we just read, all throughout chapter 6, Daniel 9, verse 1, and Daniel 11, verse 1. And interestingly, as a point, in chapter 10, 11, and 12 are one unit. We'll talk about that when we get to that last section, but they're really one unit, even though they're broken up into chapters. It's all part of the same prophecy. In chapter 10, verse 1, Daniel mentions Cyrus's reign, and then in chapter 11, verse 1, within the same context, he mentions Darius. So he mentions Cyrus in chapter 10, Darius in chapter 11, so Daniel knew they were both there. But critics look at this and say, well, Cyrus was the king, not Darius, and so Daniel's wrong here. So that's the point that's made. So let me ask you this. Let's kind of think back to a timeline. We talked about Daniel's back here in this 605 to 539 time frame when he's writing. This event happens somewhere kind of in this point right here. Critics want to say way down here in the 200s or 100s BC is when Daniel wrote, because all the stuff had already happened. So they're saying he wrote it back here and he's recording it like it's prophecy, but it's really history. So if that's the case, and the Herodotus, who wrote in here in the 400s, Isn't that right? 400 time frame, yeah. So he wrote in this time frame. He didn't know anything about who Belshazzar was. So that's why when this was all uncovered way back here in 1850, nobody from 1850 all the way back to the 400 BC knew anything about Belshazzar, but Daniel had recorded it, so it was impossible he had written it in this time frame. So let's use that same logic and think about it for a second. If somebody had written it here, and everybody knows that Cyrus, these guys recorded it, that Cyrus was the king at this point in time, how could somebody who wrote in this time frame make the mistake of saying Darius was the king when he wasn't? Does that make sense, that kind of thinking? So if a Jew at this point in time was writing it like it was prophecy, but it was history, and everybody knew Cyrus was the king, he's going to say Cyrus, the king of Babylon, right? So the fact that we've got Belshazzar giving us that history, and Daniel says Cyrus was the king, but he also says Darius the Mede was given the kingdom of Babylon, then it's hard to say it was written back here at this point in time. How could somebody make that mistake and be so stupid when they're trying to kind of write history as if it was prophecy? Does that make sense? So that's one argument against that. That goes along with it. Kind of makes it impossible he wrote at that point in time. Let's look back for a second at chapter 5, verse 31. What does it say about Darius the Mede and how he became king? What's the word that's used? Received. So what happened with the takeover that night in October of 539? It was an attack, right? I mean, they blocked off the river, they walked into the wall, but it was an attack. But this says Darius received the kingdom. What does that tell us? God or somebody gave it to him, right? I think the wording here, what it's actually telling us is that he wasn't actually the king of the whole empire. That somebody handed him, that being Cyrus, handed him the kingship over Babylon. And we can think of it, we talked about this with Belshazzar and Nabonidus, that he was king, but he wasn't really the king. He was working under his father. We see the same thing in the Roman Empire. What was Herod? He was King Herod over Israel, right? But was he really the king of the empire? No, he was under Caesar, right? He was really like a governor of that area in a sense. And so that's really what's going on here, is Darius the Mede is the ruler of Babylon, but he's not ruler of the whole empire. Cyrus is. So let's talk a little bit about who Darius really was. So there's I'll write it down for you. Gubaru, it's like Subaru with a G, that he appears in tablets that are dated from the 4th to 8 years of Cyrus. That'd be 535 to 532 BC. And he was listed as being the governor of Babylon and Eburneri. I don't know where that is. And he was still in this position much later in the 5th year of Cambyses, which was 525 BC. So from a 535 time frame to 525, we know in that time frame he was listed as being the governor of Babylon and Eburneri. He was formally designated as the governor of Babylon and the region beyond the river. And he held that position for a total of 14 years. So it's most likely that's who it is. So sometime during this transitional period, and probably a little bit after 539, he would have been appointed the viceroy over Babylon to bring the inhabitants smoothly under the Medo-Persian Empire, because they've just conquered this country and they want to make this transition and make it smooth and make them part of the kingdom and keep everything controlled so that there's not rioting and things that might happen, in a setting like that. So he was apparently given the title of Darius. And Darius does appear to be a title. I mean, I don't think we might look at that like a name, and in one sense it is, but Pharaoh is not really a name, as a title of his position. Darius is kind of that too. We see later a Darius I, Darius II, and Darius III that were kings of the Medo-Persian Empire. That's not who this is because they come later. They come much later in time. But that was a kind of a title that they assumed at those points in time some 20 years later. So he's probably given the title of Darius, which is kind of his king name, but that's probably not his real name. It was probably this Gubaru person. However, there is a different person that is possibly who happens to be named Gubaru. It's also written in some places as Ugbaru or Ugbaru. So it's spelled both ways or written both ways. He was actually the general of Cyrus' army and was apparently the one who conquered Babylon. So this would have been the guy that actually came in 539 and had the attack that actually took over Babylon. So he conquered it, and for 9 months after the capture of when Babylon was captured here in 539, in that October of 539, for 9 months after that, Cyrus didn't carry the title King of Babylon. The official documents didn't appoint him or name him as king for 9 months after that. So he wasn't yet bearing that title. His title was King of Lands. So that's how it was written after his name in the documentation up to that point. After 9 months, though, King of Babylon was added to his title in the Babylonian cuneiform texts. So for 9 months, there wasn't a King of Babylon per se after his name. And after that, so 9 months later, his title is Cyrus, King of Babylon, King of Lands, is how it was listed. So for that 9 months, his general was effectively the ruler of Babylon. So it's possible it's him. I think that's less likely because looking at the history of what happens here in Daniel, it took some time for these things to happen that we'll talk about in a minute. So it was probably this other guy that was actually appointed as the ruler over that area for 14 years. This particular guy died a year and 3 months after conquering Babylon. So he was the ruler over that area for 9 months, and then he died, a year and 3 weeks. So he died 3 months after that time that he was over that area, according to the Nabonidus Chronicle. So we don't know precisely who Darius was. It's very likely it's this guy. But obviously, Daniel has proven himself over and over with the things that were uncovered with Belshazzar, so there's no reason to doubt or to think he would have made up a fictional character or had a misunderstanding of who was in charge at that point in time. So, any questions about all that? That's the historical background, yeah. Well, first of all, I did not read Herodotus. I was actually just reading the commentaries, but they've mentioned that where that history came from. But yes, that's the understanding, is that he actually diverted the river. They dug a channel to divert the river and then diverted it so that they could actually get in under the wall. Yeah, and so that was probably this guy. I mean, he was the general. It may have been somebody else or somebody under him, but he was the one leading in that. All right. So let's move into the actual Bible story now in chapter 6. So let's read the first 5 verses here. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God." So how did Darius organize the kingdom? Yeah. So just kind of outlining what I said a minute ago, you got Cyrus, and he's over the whole Medo-Persian Empire, but over Babylon you've got Darius the Mede. Under him you've got 3 satraps, right? And then you've got 120 people under them that are the lords. So that's kind of how he structured the kingdom. And who's one of those 3 satraps? Daniel. He's one of those 3. And to what position was Daniel about to be promoted? Yeah, over all of them. So he's going to get moved up. Instead of being one of these guys, he's going to get moved up right under Darius and then have everybody else under him, right? Darius is giving thought to putting Daniel in that position. Where had Daniel risen under Nebuchadnezzar? Same position, right? Second in command under Nebuchadnezzar. Who does that remind you of in Bible history? Joseph, yeah. Brings to mind exactly Joseph. And he did that under Potiphar and then again under Pharaoh, right? So the same thing kind of happened to him. It was a little different, obviously, because it was not to the same level. But Daniel's second in command there, and then again here he's about to be put in that position. So, back to a little bit of what Lynn said at the beginning of class. Does that mean if we serve God faithfully and we're very active and we say the things we're supposed to say and live the way we're supposed to live, that God's going to bless us and we're going to rise in power and success in a worldly standpoint. What do you mean by the former? Because God's going to bless us, but not necessarily in a physical sense, right? Is it possible we'll suffer harm instead? Absolutely. Now, one point to think about as we move through this, we think about where Daniel landed at the end of it, but was it always an easy path to get there? I mean, we see him go through a lion's den to get there, right? We saw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego go through a fiery furnace to get there. So would you call that suffering? I mean, it's worse than anything any of us are going to probably have to ever endure. So just because we're looking at the end result for them doesn't mean that everything was all peaches and cream the whole time. So let me ask you this. Question 2 on your lesson sheet says, how does Daniel's status here in chapter 6, how does that relate back to his decision in chapter 1, verse 8? What was chapter 1, verse 8? What did he do there? He purposed in his heart not to defile God, right? So he purposed in his heart to be a follower of God precisely in everything, not to defile himself. So he made that decision as a young man way back in chapter 1, verse 8. So what application can we make from that? First, how does that relate to what happens here? I didn't ask you the whole question. Yeah, it kind of defined who he was everywhere, right? And he made it way back then, and so he's practiced that for years and years now. And so that's kind of defined who he is. He is not going to defile himself. He's going to follow God. And so that really is the basis of why he is where he is. So I ask you there, what application can we make from this? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and if you think about way back there in chapter 1, is what you eat such a big deal? Yeah, not as big as this is. I mean, to a Jew, that was a big deal because that was a big part of defining who they were. But if you think about it, what we eat, is that really such a big deal? That's some rationalizing that he could have been doing at that point in time. And if he had given in on that, he'd never ended up where he is here. But that started a foundation. He continued to build on that. And so that being faithful in the little things, Jesus says, we'll be faithful in much if we're faithful in little. And so being faithful in those little things is really important. What other applications did you put down? Absolutely. Just our children? How about us? So absolutely, yeah. He had to have been trained before that point because he's on his own now, so he's not getting parental guidance anymore back in chapter 1. But we can still make that same decision, right? Is it too late for any of us to purpose in our heart? Doesn't matter how old we are, right? I mean, for those of us in this room who are old now, we can still purpose in our heart. Even in areas maybe where we haven't been what we should be in the past, we can make that decision right now. So that's an application for us, and it will build and grow if we do that. So there's a lot for us to learn just from that. And I keep going back to that because I really think that defines who Daniel is through the rest of his life. That little, what seems like a little decision that he made way back there not to defile himself is huge. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for us it's not typically governmental rules, it's more societal rules that aren't really written. You're right, that's a good point. So there are consequences of previous decisions. They can be good consequences from good decisions. They can be bad consequences. Daniel, because he'd been serving since a youth, he probably had very little in the way of physical consequences of sin that were following him. We don't know that, but very, very unlikely. However, there were other consequences that were bad that came out of his good decisions. He'd fallen out of favor with Nabonidus, right? We know by the time that Belshazzar was king that he didn't even really acknowledge who Daniel was and didn't really remember who he was. He's about to be thrown in a lion's den here. We don't know what anything else had happened along the way. But if you think back in chapter 2, he was about to be killed, right? Before he interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he was on the chopping block. And he called him up and said, give me time to talk to God and I'll get the answer for you. So he wasn't free from suffering. Again, we're looking at the end of the story sometimes and thinking, oh, everything turned out really well. But he went through some difficult times to get there. So those who are willing to serve God from their youth or from wherever we are right now will be blessed, but in differing ways. It may just be spiritual blessings, and it may be all physical suffering. There may be minimal physical suffering involved, but we'll be blessed no matter what. So kind of back to what Wally was saying, there's going to be blessing if we follow God. But it doesn't mean we're not going to have difficulties along the path. Let's look at question 1. Assuming Daniel was 12 when he was taken captive in chapter 1, we don't know that. I just picked an age. I think personally he was probably 12 to 15 age range, but we don't really know. But if you assume he was 12 then, how old would he be at this point in time? Assuming this is 539. He'd actually be a little bit older than that at this point. 78 is what I calculated, yeah. If you go from 605, if he was 12 and 605, and if you assume, a race of timeline, if you assume this is 539, he's going to be 78 years old. Using the BC numbers sometimes gets you because you've got to go backwards with them. So it's 605 up to 539. Add 12 to that, he would be 78 at this point in time. So he's probably somewhere 78 or older. And this is probably a little after 539 because if you think about the history that I erased, this guy was the governor for 9 months before he was appointed. And so if this is Darius the Mede, he says this happened in the first year of Darius the Mede, so it's going to be sometime after that. So we're probably more than a year after, so this is probably more like 538 or 537 even when this actually happens. So he's old at this point. So question for us, what can we apply from that? Yeah, remain faithful and active, right? I mean, he's still being an active servant of God here. Why would I ask you that question? That's kind of obvious, isn't it? What do we tend to do as we get older, though? We relax, yeah. In our country, we quit, and I think in a lot of civilizations, you retire and you quit working hard from an earthly standpoint, and we kind of carry that mindset into our spiritual life sometimes, too. And I know our abilities change as we get older and what we can and can't do and how we use our time and our energy and everything else, but it doesn't give us the license to quit being an active servant of God. We see Daniel here continuing very actively in that. All right, let's look at question 3, first part of that. And what did the governors and satraps not find fault with Daniel? The kingdom, yeah, so in the government laws, right? They didn't find any fault with him in that. Second part of that question, in what could they find fault with him? Yeah, through his God. So they were going to have to find fault in that in some way. Does that wording mean that he was not serving God faithfully? Is that what they're saying? No, but if they want to find fault that they can cause problems for him, they're going to have to do it through his service to God in some ways, is what that's telling us. So let me just ask you this question. This is not for you to answer out loud. This is for you to think about. If you were in this position, where would they find fault in you? Would they be able to just look at the law of the land or moral laws and find fault in you without even having to go to the law of your God and trying to trap you in that? So it's just something for us to ponder personally and think about. So I ask you in part C of that question, how can we be like this today? How can we be like Daniel in that regard? John?
I don't remember exactly. At least that's the suffering of all praise, the suffering of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so don't... Yeah, so... Yeah. So serving faithfully in the laws of the land and also serving our God faithfully so that if somebody's going to find fault in us, it's going to be that way, but being ready to suffer persecution if that happens. Yep. And that's a mindset, isn't it? We got to have that mindset. What else did y'all put down? Yeah. Yeah. So let's along that line, let's look at Colossians 3:22 through 24. That's not precisely what you had mentioned, but it goes along with it. Actually, it is the passage you were referring to. I hadn't written all that down in my notes. You want to read that for us, Guthrie? Colossians 3:22 to 24.
from the heart, or as something done from the Lord and not from people?
Go back to the beginning of 22 and read from there.
Slaves, obey your human masters in everything. Don't work only while being watched as people pleasers, but work wholeheartedly, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, do it from the heart, as something done for the Lord, and not for people. Knowing that you receive the reward of an inheritance from the Lord, you serve the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for what is wrong he's done, and there is no escape.
So obeying those who are over us, working heartily as if we're working for the Lord rather than working for our masters. That's the message just being given there. If that's the attitude that we have, that whatever I'm working in, I'm working for the Lord, I'm working in His cause, then people aren't going to be able to find fault with us in the things of this world because we're doing that the right way. If you go back to verse 17 of the same chapter there, it says, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. So whatever we're doing, whether it's work or school or our home lives or anything else, doing it all towards Him. Ecclesiastes 9:10, whatever your hand finds to do it with your might. Jenny.
I think in the passage in Daniel 6 it says that he had distinguished himself from the children and here, and I thought at first it was where it talks about keeping our behavior excellent from the inside and the outside, saying distinguish yourself from the Lord. The Lord takes for everything in execution. And there's a way in which we can still distinguish ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not in a way that people like, but it's a way to glorify God and we show our respect and obedience to our earthly authority. They're going to see something different about us. So
Yeah.
exactly what Daniel did intended.
Yeah, there's a reason why people who serve God faithfully stand out in whatever environment they're in, workplace, school, anywhere else. There's a reason, because they function and work differently and for a different purpose. They're serving the Lord in what they're doing and not just doing it for the money or doing it for the earthly glory or anything else. They're working for the Lord, and they look different, they act different, they handle things differently. And so that should be us. Just let me ask you a question again. This is a kind of a rhetorical question, but is it possible or even likely that morals and beliefs in our country will degrade to the point that there are aspects of true service to God that become illegal or socially unacceptable, which is already true for sure, and that's where others would have to go to find fault in us? If we're living in the right way, then they're going to have to go to the fact that we're not following the social standards because we're serving God. And there's areas where that's definitely already happened. So again, do I serve God heartily in all these areas so that others will want to find fault in me if they're trying to cause a problem for me? They're going to have to go to that area. And a couple of verses I know that you know, 2 Timothy 3:12, all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. So we're going to have problems if we live faithfully and live godly. John 15:19 through 20, Jesus said, if you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. So we may not suffer to the degree that Daniel did, but if we live godly, there is going to be opposition to us out of jealousy. So let's talk about the new decree here. So we're looking at verses 6 through 9. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read them because I'm a little bit behind what I wanted to cover. So what did Daniel's opponents do?
Because the king passed a law that would, they knew would conflict with what Daniel did,
Yeah.
so that they could get him in trouble by the law.
And that law was you can't make a request or petition or serve any other god except the king for 30 days. Or wasn't it 30 days? Yeah. So that's the law they got him to make. Why did they do that? I'm sorry? Power, yeah, they're jealous of his power, right? And I think they're jealous of the position, because he's about. It's not a mistake. It's not an accident that it's pointed out Daniel's about to be promoted to being over everybody, and then this happens. That's just not an accident. But I think it's also interesting when they go to the king. What do they? There's a kind of a racial slur that they bring in. What do they say? Yeah, one of the exiles of the Jews. So they didn't bring that up just because he didn't know who Daniel was, right? He knows who Daniel is. He's about to point him to that point. So they're making a point. He's not Babylonian. He's not Medo-Persian. He's one of the exiles of the Jews. And so there's some jealousy on that level, too, that he's being appointed to those positions, and he's not even one of them. So that was included for a reason as well. So let me ask you this. As we read through the chapter, and I know you've read the chapter already, Darius is not happy about what happens, is he? And we're going to talk about that more as we get into the next class especially, but he's not happy about what happened. So he likes Daniel. How could he have been duped in this way? I mean, he's put as a king over a whole area. How could he be duped in that kind of a way? Maybe his own pride. So yeah, they come to him and they say that they'll elevate you. So that's definitely could be part of it. What are some? I think there's a lot of. We're not told why, but there's a lot of things that go into it. Because I think at first reading, you'd look at that and go, "The guy's an idiot," but he's clearly not. Yeah. When they come to him with this position, Barbara. Yeah, and if you think about it again, he's appointed here to bring this under the Medo-Persian Empire and to make everything unified, right? And he's ruling this area, and so he's trying to appease them probably is a big part of that. Think about what Pilate did with Jesus. He knew what was right there, didn't he? When you read that story, he knew that he could tell Jesus wasn't guilty and certainly didn't deserve to be crucified, but he gave in to the people because he was afraid it was going to cause a riot. And there's probably some of that here too. Another point, how many people came to him? The vast majority, right? And the NIV doesn't use the best wording there, but the New King James says they thronged before him, the New American Standard by agreement. They're all coming to him at one time, or in a close batch together. And so it's painting the picture, everybody's for this, right? All of your leaders, all 123 people want this to happen. And so he's in one sense, as Wally just said, he's maybe kind of signing off on it because everybody that's under him is telling him this, and he maybe just doesn't recognize not everybody's agreeing with this. The easy thing to do here, yeah. And they claim that they represented all the governors of the kingdom, right? They make that claim to him, and so he's just kind of going along with it without truly investigating it. So he's trying to keep the peace. He's trying to do what he was tasked with and unifying this country, and they all come to him at one time. So I think it's kind of understandable. He's not an idiot here. Yes, he clearly should have investigated more, and he's mad at himself. You see that very clearly. He's mad at himself for the decision that he made. Jim? Yeah. Yeah, also, it's only 30 days. What's the big deal, right? Yeah, okay. So, Daniel's guilty of the new law. Question 4, what did Daniel do when the decree was signed? Huh? Yes, so he just said, I'm going to violate the law? Yeah. When Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. So he's just doing what he's always done in his relationship with God, right? He's not thinking, I'm going to violate that law. They can't do that. They can't make a statement like that. I'm going to oppose it. It's what he's always done. It's his religious practice, and so that's what he's going to do. Let me ask you this. Was going into your room, opening your windows towards Jerusalem, and praying 3 times a day required under the old law? No. Not listed anywhere. That's not a requirement. So why didn't he just change what he was doing? Now that's illegal. In fact, let me ask you this. Shouldn't he have changed it? Now it's illegal. It's not something he has to do. So shouldn't he have said, it's illegal to do this. I'm just going to change my practice because I don't have to do that. I'm not required by God to do it. So wouldn't he have been a better servant of God if he had actually followed the law and not done that?